friendly member for Knowsley said that the government is governing in slogans. Yes, he's right, but those slogans come with a cost. £300 million of taxpayers' money already wasted, possibly another £100 million to go on a system which the Department of Home Permanent Secretary said will not work, and the money having to be signed off by ministerial order rather than by the civil servants.
And is this the first try? No, my honourable friend, the member for Felton said this is the third bite of the cherry in terms of trying to solve this problem. The member for Bournemouth West said we need to keep the faith and be straight with the public. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we do need to be straight with the public. This bill not only won't work, it will also damage the international reputation of this country. It will also end a situation where, expectations are raised, taxpayers' money is wasted, and it needs to be ditched. And that's why we're voting against it tonight. I look at the spectacle of the Conservative Party tearing itself apart with interest, like we all do. But that coalition, which is a Conservative Party, which I may disagree with myself politically, I have respect for some individuals in it. What's happening now is not good, I think, for our democracy. Sadly, the tired old nag, which is this government, will only be put out of its misery when we have a general election.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Our country finds itself in a very difficult situation, and the government rightly made a commitment to the public that we would both stem illegal immigration and protect our borders, while upholding our moral and legal duty to offer refuge to those fleeing violence or persecution. Our efforts to stop people dying in the Channel, to stop the criminal gangs, to stop the boats, have been opposed at every turn. Opposed by the party opposite, opposed through the legal system, and of course opposed by the criminal gangs profiting from the dangerous and illegal routes. It is claimed that this is a UK problem alone, that it's our government's problem alone, but it's in fact a problem shared with our neighbours and allies across Europe who face their own often greater challenges with illegal immigration. And these challenges are not going away, but instead, with the consequences of climate change and global instability, they are likely to only get worse. Our approach to asylum needs to be fair, both to the asylum seekers themselves and our communities have opened their hearts and homes to those seeking refuge, but it must be through safe and legal routes. We cannot cede control of our borders to criminal gangs. We must tackle illegal immigration. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is often cited as the barrier preventing control of our borders. And I'm proud of the UK's leading role in promoting human rights across the globe. I want us to continue this and to support the ECHR. But the judgments of the court do appear to have moved away from simply guaranteeing the basic and fundamental rights enshrined in the treaty. Judgments have begun to infringe on democratic decision-making, and there appears no obvious way to hold the court to account. It's been called judicial activism, but whatever you call it, the answer is not to withdraw from the ECHR or break international law. The answer is to come together again, as we did in 1949, to find the answers to the challenges of the present day. This will take time. Of course it will take time. And the government right now must take steps within its power to control illegal immigration. Now, colleagues may remember my unease over a previous bill which threatened to break international law. And I was unable to support that unamended. And had the same issues arisen here, my sentiment would be the same. But the difference here is that I've been assured that the bill as stands does not break international law. It is by no means perfect, and we could spend a lot of time seeking perfection. But the challenges we face are real and impacting on lives now. And I will therefore give my caveated support to this bill tonight as a near-term measure to tackle illegal immigration. But at the same time, I give my unwavering support to the government to engage with our international partners and work towards a long-term sustainable solution.
Del Rovira Adi.
Deputy Speaker, public services are on the verge of collapse. The gap between rich and poor has widened and we're slipping back into a Victorian area. Food bank usage at an all-time high and workers haven't had a decent pay rise in 15 years, but we're not here to talk about that today. In fact, we're barely here to talk about those things in any meaningful way. We are here to legislate on the dog-whistle fantasist policies of the party opposite, electioneering when they should be governing, not offering any real solutions to problems and attempting to divert attention from their own failings as a government, wasting the time of this House and squandering the goodwill of the people of this country. We keep going round and round on this matter. And our Supreme Court has ruled on this. It found Rwanda to be unsafe. This was based on evidence. Legislating the opposite is not going to rid us of the facts. This is not an exercise in parliamentary sovereignty. It's actually an abuse of this Parliament's functions. It undermines the rule of law and the constitutional separation of powers. Yes, we are lawmakers and we can make and change the law, but the law cannot be used to change the facts. And another fact is that this treaty with Rwanda, coupled with the bill, actually breaches many of our obligations under international law. And if we were in doubt in any way, the government has helpfully outlined this throughout the entire bill. Clause 3, for example, excludes the applications of key sections of the Human Rights Act. It directly prevents the courts from applying the bill in a way that is compatible with convention rights. It prevents any consideration of previous rulings from the European Court of Human Rights that have found Rwanda unsafe, and it removes human rights obligations from public bodies, including courts. This bill would place an obligation on every single decision maker that has found Rwanda unsafe to simply rule it as safe. It restricts the court's ability to protect people at risk of harm, and it restricts individual legal protections. Does the government fully understand what this means? Do they see how far they have sunk? That they are so fanatic about this flawed policy that they would bar courts from considering the very reasons that Rwanda might be unsafe, stripping people of individual legal protections? From its very outset, Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is ridiculous. Honourable members opposite would do well to note that there is no more empire. International law is not whatever we say it is. It's comprised of agreements and treaties adopted by members of this House. To dismiss these as the rules of foreign courts is as irresponsible as it is untrue. We signed up to these solemn and binding rules, so this bill actually risks our international reputation and it makes us hypocrites. How dare we condemn other countries that do not uphold international law, and how dare we preach to them when we would undermine the rule of law? But this government doesn't really care for that. It cares more for the squabbles of its own party than our standing as a country. If this government were actually serious about resolving the issues surrounding small boats, they would actually do more to target people traffickers. They would provide safe and legal routes. People do not take these perilous journeys for fun. They are often fleeing some of the worst persecution. They are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, not the party opposite scapegoats. It's already been said today, but those who seek asylum from countries like Ukraine and Hong Kong don't have to come by unconventional means because the government has given them the ability to do so. So the government needs to stop misleading the public with its use of the word illegal, because seeking asylum in this country is not illegal. It's not against any of our laws, domestic or international, and it is the government that has exacerbated the asylum system, not the vulnerable people that are seeking asylum. And we know this because the vast majority of claims are justified. After lengthy delays, 3/4 of applications are accepted, and the longer these processes drag on, the longer refugees and asylum seekers are prevented from rebuilding their lives here in this country, working and contributing to our economy. This government has already spent hundreds of millions of pounds on a policy that is as crap as it is unworkable. And there is nothing... And there is nothing more telling than the fact that the Secretary of State has been unable to make a Section 19 statement. He could not say that this bill was compatible with the Convention on Human Rights. The Home Secretary means to take us all for fools. For the second time this year, he cannot say that his plans for removing asylum seekers to Rwanda will not break international law. The Rwandan government have been very clear. They have said they will not continue with this deal if it does not meet the highest standards of international law. This bill does not do this. This government is wasting our time. This is not going to work, and I'm not even sure it was meant to. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sick and tired of being dragged through this House to approve legislation that does nothing to improve the lives of my constituents or uphold the values of our society. This bill should simply not be allowed to go any further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure that when all members rush to read Hansard tomorrow, they will hear the word or read the word crass.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Crass. And I'm sure Hansard have just taken a note of that. David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I draw the House's attention to my register of interests. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the starting point for the debate that we are having today has been the good work of a series of Conservative education, immigration ministers working closely with their counterparts in France. In particular, it's worth recalling the contribution of our late colleague James Brokenshire, who's worked with the French authorities to increase the security at the ferry terminals, the lorry parks, and in particular around the Channel Tunnel in northern France, has been, whilst enormously successful in reducing the numbers, putting their lives at risk, smuggling themselves to the UK by that route, has been instrumental in driving those gangs to use small boats across the Channel as the means of carrying on their trade. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I started out as something of a Rwanda sceptic, but having spent many years in local government and seen the cost challenges that face many of our local authorities supporting refugees and asylum seekers in the UK, it did seem to me a very expensive policy per capita. But having had the opportunity to reflect both on the visits I placed to the jungle in Calais in 2016, before the security measures were put in place, and what I've heard from our agencies, including both the French and the UK agencies operating against the gangs in France, and from some of those migrants themselves waiting to cross the Channel, it seems very clear to me that this is a policy which has, as part of the wider range of measures, great utility in acting as a deterrent. It will not by any means apply to everybody, and we know people will continue to come to the UK, including as they've done to the local authority in which I served, through the routes into Heathrow Airport. But a measure that helps address the particular unique circumstances that we face in the English Channel is absolutely essential. And it seems to me that this Rwanda policy and the bill set out today has enormous utility in addressing the risks that people are putting themselves to and the profits that those criminal gangs have continued to make. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, a great deal of the debate has focused around the detail of the legalities of this bill. And it certainly seems to me an enormous improvement in where we've been previously, and reflects the judgment of the Supreme Court in saying the key concern that needs to be satisfied is that anybody who is sent to Rwanda as a result of this policy needs to have sufficient safeguards on their human rights, that we can be confident in particular that they would not be moved on to another country where those human rights would be abused. And that replicates the agreements that we have in respect of deportations to many other countries, and also upholds the standards that we would see from the United Nations, the European Union, from countries like Austria and Germany, which are already exploring with Rwanda and others similar arrangements in order to address their like concerns about the impact of high levels of uncontrolled migration across Europe and elsewhere. And I reflect on the fact that I am receiving a great deal of lobbying from leading figures in my local authorities who are enormously concerned that the cumulative cost of accommodating large numbers of people who've arrived in a fairly short space of time means that we are struggling to ensure that access to housing, access to education, access to other important public services is maintained to the standard that we would wish to. And that in that context,
dealing with those who, as a number of members have highlighted, have effectively jumped the queue, rather than those who have played fair, who followed the correct process, who come here because of their connections to the UK, represents an unfair loss of public money for that purpose. And it seems to me also that whilst this bill is not perfect, set alongside the work that's been done by a number of ministers to improve decision-making in the Home Office, the arrangements that have been made working with local authorities through things like the National Resettlement Scheme for refugee children, which has led to the fairly seamless now accommodation of more than double the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in the UK, that's seen additional local authority areas volunteering to become dispersal areas for asylum seekers and to take part in resettlement schemes compared to where we've been before. And the continued contribution that foreign students, 600,000 of whom we committed to bring to this country in our election manifesto of 2019, the contribution that they continue to make to our economy, which now represents a foreign currency earner larger than our oil and gas industry. So that demonstrates a migration and immigration policy that, in the round, continues to serve the interests of the British people. And I'd just like to finish on this question, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We've heard a great deal of criticism of the policy and challenges back, in particular, to those who aspire to form a government about what their policy would be. A key issue which I've not yet heard addressed, in the point that's made about a new unit with maybe 1,000 staff to act as a returns unit. If a negotiated agreement of this nature, with this legal basis with Rwanda, is not sufficient, then I think it is incumbent on the party opposite to answer which other countries are they seeking to negotiate those agreements with? To what extent have those agreements been reached? Because if returns agreements are the key policy that the Labour Party wishes to have as a point of difference, then it is clear at the moment that that emperor very much has no clothes.
Ms. Savile Roberts.
Let's not beat around the bush here. This bill is in retaliation. It is a crass payback, if you like, to the Supreme Court decision on the 15th of November that the government's Rwanda asylum plan was unlawful. This sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the democratic contracts of the state while undermining what constitutes the truth. Declaring something to be true doesn't make it fact. Evidently, this bill also undermines the UK's international treaties and conventions, including, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights, with which the Home Secretary has stated that this bill may not comply. Sections 2, 3 and 6 through to 9 of the Human Rights Act 1998 are also disapplied. The UK government then acts hypocritically, requiring the Rwandan government to abide by the standards of international law while disapplying them itself. This bill does reputational damage to the UK at home and abroad. The government may say that others have set a precedent for this bill. This argument is flimsy. The UN Committee on Torture has expressed concerns about Denmark's intentions to move refugees elsewhere, and Israel, of course, abandoned its agreement to send Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers to Rwanda and Uganda, having been halted temporarily after legality challenges. This legislation faces a series of hurdles, each likely to bring it down. And it comes, of course, at an unforgivable price. It's reportedly cost $240 million so far, with another $50 million agreed. And then we heard from the Secretary of State that it's another $50 million and then yet another $50 million on top. It is in no way possible to justify this in the state of cost of living crisis which we face. And no matter what the UK government believes, Rwanda has been proven not to be a safe country for those people seeking asylum. The bill fails to address key issues raised by the Supreme Court, including that of human rights issues. Refugees have historically been ill-treated after expressing criticism of the government, with new provisions such as the appeal body untested. 15 Rwandan nationals have been granted protection since 2020, with this bill excluding Rwandan nationals from its scope. How is this compatible with any definition of a safe country? And under this bill, anyone who arrives in the UK without a legitimate visa and has travelled via a safe country would be subject to removal. But what about those people fleeing conflict zones, unable to access documents such as passports and visas as embassies close down? What about the many Afghan men and women who were a crucial resource to the UK government, left stranded and in peril? Where are the safe and legal routes? This bill, of course, is an affront to Plaid Cymru's values and Wales's aim of being a true nation of sanctuary. We are proud to be on the side of equality, wanting every single person to have the same opportunities and the same access to justice, resources and services. We want to end recourse to public funds conditions and allow all migrants and people seeking asylum access to the public services they require. How this is found to be contentious by the UK government is beyond belief. Instead, of course, of electioneering and distraction policies, the government should indeed be expanding safe routes to ensure that fewer people decide to take the tortuous journey across the Channel and at the mercy of smugglers. Now, to close, Deputy Speaker, I just wanted to refer to an example, a model Professor Emyr Lewis of the Department of Law in Aberystwyth, what he uses when he is teaching public law in that university, in the way that he illustrates the legislative supremacy of the UK Parliament through an imaginary potential act. The name of this imaginary potential act? Its name is the location of Aberystwyth, open brackets, on the moon, close brackets, bill. If an MP were to sponsor this act and the government were to support it, it would become law, and no court in England or Wales could overturn it. But the reality of the location of Aberystwyth would remain utterly unchanged. When we are talking about the potential of this act to change the reality, I think we would do well to learn the lesson of Professor Emyr Lewis.
Well said.
Matt Warman.
Deputy Speaker, this bill tackles an issue that is vital to many of our constituents. We all know how important numbers of legal migration and amounts of illegal migration are. I know from my own constituency, a constituency that is generous and kind, but there are real tensions when 5 hotels are used for illegal migration in a town like Skegness. There is no justification for that position, and the residents being put in it are rightly angry. When we get issues such as this wrong, we strain the social fabric of our country, and the government has a duty not just to try and tackle it, but to strain every sinew to try and tackle it. So I welcome, perhaps surprisingly even to myself, I welcome how far this bill goes. I welcome the fact that it is doing something novel. But I am uncomfortable in that position, because what this bill does is to go up to the line of international law. And international law is important, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not because of some sentimental approach about what it means, or even the fact that Britain was involved in writing some of it. It's important for 2 reasons to me. One, because it is the foundation upon which we are able to do the deals with other countries, for instance, Albania, France, Italy, that allow us to tackle illegal migration. Because Rwanda cannot be the only thing that we do. Rwanda has to be, if it is to happen, a part of a meaningful package of measures. And if we go so far in one direction to try and ensure that flights to Rwanda take off, we will knock out other important parts of the deal that we need to do. So we need to be very careful about walking a tightrope, because when I say that I am uncomfortable on that tightrope, I think others are uncomfortable for a very different reason. But that is what successful compromise on all sides looks like. If we try and go further the risk is not just that we undermine our whole approach to tackling this issue with a multi-pronged approach. It also risks simply undermining Britain's whole standing in the world. So we'll have a policy that won't work and a country that is less than where we started. No one in this House, I think, wants that. And there is, to use the phrase that's been around so much recently, the simple risk that we make the perfect the enemy of the good. This has been called by people with a star chamber. We shouldn't perhaps forget that it was the very first star chamber that started the Civil War in England. So maybe we've had enough of star chambers, but we should be alive to the fact that even the Star Chamber that has been convened so recently declared this a partial solution. And there's a danger of saying that something is a partial solution and therefore it is no good. For me, a partial solution is better than no solution. And we have to, I think tonight, grasp that nettle that says, yes, much of this is uncomfortable for many across the Conservative Party. But we should be united in our desire to tackle what is an issue that matters to all of our constituents, and we should have no shame in saying that this is a plan that we can get behind, and it contrasts so sharply with the total lack of a plan from the other side of the House. If you want to criticise the Conservative approach, and people I gather do, then it is incumbent on those people to come up with their ideas, and not simply to say we'll employ more people to do it, because the fact is this government has already employed more people to do it. Not simply to say we will try harder. The BBC accused the Labour Party of replacing a bill simply with hope. And I thought that was generous, if I was honest. But there has to be an alternative, a responsible opposition, a responsible aspirational government surely has to come up with those plans, and yet we hear nothing. So the twofold reason to get behind what we have in front of us is that it is an idea that will work in terms of making a difference to this critical problem. But it is also the only idea in town. The reason we have found ourselves in this excruciatingly difficult position is simply because it is an intractable problem. And I think in the absence of better ideas, people need to be careful what they wish for. So I will give way.
I mean, he's standing there, Mr Deputy Speaker, saying that there's no credible options, when we have heard multiple speakers and multiple organisations and lawyers say that there are credible options. Create safe routes and stop making people illegal, because no one is illegal. People are human beings and they are coming here for very good reasons, coming from countries that we've happily gone and bombed and interfered in, and now we're not willing to take people in their hour of need.
I simply don't understand a line that says we're not willing to take people in their hour of need. When you look at the Ukraine scheme, you look at the Hong Kong scheme, there is huge evidence of this country, and dare I say it, England more than Scotland, housing those people who are in their hour of need. So I think it is right, she is right to say that safe routes are a crucial part of this problem. And I agree with her insofar as it goes, but that shouldn't be a stick to beat people with in pretending that we haven't played a huge part. The role of the UK is one that we should be immensely proud of. But, as I say, I find myself voting for this bill this evening, not with huge enthusiasm, for anything other than the concept of addressing a problem that we have a moral duty to address. And I want to end by saying that the view from a constituency such as mine, which has a long history of a complex relationship with migration, is that when politicians make promises that they don't keep, it fractures not just the social fabric, but also that vital democratic thread that gives us legitimacy when we come here. So we have a duty to tackle the issue, we have a duty to do so in a way that makes a meaningful difference, and I think we have a duty to unite behind a plan, even if we don't think it's perfect, that will make a real difference tonight. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much, Florence Shalami.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. was just thinking about, I attended my son's nativity play this morning. He was an angel, 6-year-old. Yeah. And just remembering the story, obviously, of baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and the fact of, you know, the young children were playing the knocking noise of trying to find a room, and there was no space and no room, being turned away. And I just think about what's happened to our basic decency as a country. What's happened to our compassion? Where people are fleeing, we just want to close the door on them. And I think about the fact that our public services over the last 13 years under this government have left us with a dysfunctional asylum system. The figures show that at the end of September this year, over 160,000 people were waiting for an initial decision. And we should also remember that 75% of asylum claims are granted on the initial decisions, and half of those appeals against initial appeals were allowed, doubling the amount from in 2010. And we're talking about people fleeing war, we're talking about people fleeing persecution. And they go through so much stress that I hope that none of us in this House would ever want to experience. And these are people who just want to start a new life after leaving their country of origin after such horrific circumstances. But for the vast majority of them, the welcome they get in the UK is one that waits over 6 months and running into a year. And then after that, if they're lucky, they're given just 28 days to navigate the housing system to find a job after breaking inactivity. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent Vauxhall, a place where our diversity is celebrated, it's welcomed. People are welcomed, people from all over the country, other communities making our community in Vauxhall stronger. And the current situation facing many people fleeing persecution is unacceptable and inhumane, and it gets worse. During their time waiting for a decision, their life is on hold. They're often stuck in unsuitable accommodation, including one of the hotels in my constituency. I'll give way to
The last time I got off the train in Paris when I was on the Council of Europe, you walk out of the main station, the Gare du Nord in Paris, and there is a row of North African men asleep in sleeping bags outside. When was the last time she saw that at a London station? Never.
I'm not really sure what reference that has, but in terms of the Honourable Lady's statement in terms of what's happening in Paris, we've got a government who is saying that people sleeping in tents shouldn't be housed. We've got a government demonising communities. We've got a government who want to demonise those communities. And I hope we never get to that situation. But the reality is that there are a number of people living in worse conditions, in hotel accommodations, living in a room with 4 of your family members with no cooking facilities, eating really bad processed food. Is not a way that people should be living. And this is something that her government have failed to deal with. In terms of the government looking at this mess that they've created over the last 13 years, we're all honest, and I think we all need to agree that yes, we do need to look at urgent action to stop the exploitative gangs that are putting so many vulnerable people into terrifying and perilous boat situations. But sadly, what we've got from the government is yet again a broken plan and no clue in how we're really going to solve and address this problem. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are 2 reasons why I can't support this bill today. I think the first is going back to the simple waste of taxpayers' money towards achieving the government's goal. Under the scheme, 300 million of public money has been spent without a single asylum seeker being sent to Rwanda. That's £300 million of public money that's been spent on achieving nothing. That money could be spent in our schools, in our hospitals, or towards properly tackling down on the criminal smuggler gangs that facilitate dangerous crossings at source. But instead, we get a scheme that's failing and risk breaking our international obligations and diminishing our standing in the world. And I think that's why members should think hard about supporting this bill. Think about how much that money could do in all our respective constituencies. The UK government's own guidance on Rwanda says LGBT individuals can experience discrimination and abuse, including from local authorities. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we must be aware of the number of refugees who flee their country of origin because of the persecution on the grounds of political repression and sexuality. My Vauxhall constituency is a proud LGBT-friendly place, and I'll always stand up to protect communities from the global persecution they face. Earlier this year at UK Black Pride, I met with African Rainbow Family, a charity that helps and supports LGBTQI people from African and BME backgrounds. And they spoke about the difficulties they've had and their members have had with navigating a Home Office system. They spoke about the long waits in terms of people waiting for their asylum claims. They spoke about the fact that they feel that continuously they're being persecuted, and that's coming from the top of this government. So we should be really worried and concerned that we are seeing a bill that wishes for us to not respect our international treaties and our obligations, but yet demonising and othering people. That should not be happening in 2023. And we see a bill that has no sign of being effective at its main aim to deter the Channel crossings. This bill pleases no one and does nothing to help solve the problems in our asylum system. Instead, we should be looking at how we can work with our international partners in our community to address some of the humanitarian crises that are the key cause of people fleeing their homes in the first instance. We should look at how we can work with those communities so people don't need to flee their homes in the first instance. We should look at how we can spend money to tackle a serious plan to crack down on the criminal gangs and clear the massive backlog in our asylum system. We've all sat on those MP surgeries raising cases, and I see the right honourable member in the front. He was very helpful when he was immigration minister, sitting down, raising those cases that have been there before I was elected 4 years ago, cases of people who are still waiting for an answer from the Home Office. That's what we should be doing. So I urge the government to withdraw this bill and look at other ways to help people.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Doncaster is full. Now, I often get challenged, I often get challenged as a Christian when I say Doncaster is full. But I don't think it's very Christian putting people in boats that are going to, obviously, sadly, sometimes fall. I don't think it's Christian promising people a life in this country when we don't have the services for them. And I don't think it's Christian taking the best people from developing countries because we don't train our own in this country. I don't think it's Christian when my constituents are having to put up with immigration at the levels that they are. Now, we've heard the lawyers in this House speak so eloquently, as they often do, and we hear the left-wing lawyers do the same. But the lawyers in this place, at least they are probably trying to help, at least on this side of the House. Unfortunately, outside, we have left-wing lawyers making six-figure salaries, calling me awful, and people like myself. We have TV pundits on seven-figure salaries, paid by my constituents through TV licences, again calling me awful. Well, I asked these people on these huge salaries, on these seven-figure salaries, I asked them to sell everything that they've got. I asked them to give it all away. Then I asked them to come and get a job in Doncaster, probably on £25,000, £30,000 a year. I asked them to find themselves a partner and then probably go and buy that dream house. Now, they buy that dream house, a three-bedroom semi and mid-terraced. They make the garden nice, the kids play in the garden, they've got a couple next door who've got kids themselves, and everything's rosy. Then all of a sudden the neighbour decides to move on, he gets a job or he moves somewhere else, and that house turned into an HMO. And then we have 9 people who don't speak English anymore, bed hopping, which is what's happening, and it's no good saying it's not happening, it's happening. And it's happening. If anyone wants to come and have a look, then please come and have a look. Because, I'm sorry, you're burying your head in your sands, trying to make yourselves look good in front of people to get votes. But this is happening, and it's happening in Doncaster, and it's happening in places throughout this country, and we are turning parts of our community into a ghetto. And this is what is happening. Now, all of a sudden, you're living next door to an HMO, and you've got comings and goings at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, people outside smoking. The grass doesn't get cut anymore, the windows don't get cleaned anymore, and unfortunately you feel scared to let your child play out in the garden anymore. Now, there's no gated communities here to make people feel safe, because we're not on seven-figure salaries anymore. You're earning £30,000 now, remember, that's what you're earning. So the only protection that you've got is a lock on a door and a council that might put a public space protection order in, but not enforce it anymore. Now this is what's happening. You can't sell your house anymore, and if you do, you have to sell it at a discount. Your little child falls over in the street and you have to go to A&E. And you get a 12-hour waiting list. And the reason why the waiting list is so long is because people don't speak English in these places anymore. And this is what is happening. You then go to the schools, and the schools classes are over and oversized. And this is what's happening. Now you can shout me down, you can say what you want, I really don't care. But this is what's happening. And we have to tackle this illegal immigration and this immigration because it is not fair. Because that couple that I'm talking about are paying their taxes week in, week out. They expect to live on nice streets. They expect to be able to have the services there for them that they pay for week in, week out. And they don't expect to be called racist or xenophobic for saying, we liked it as it was. And if we're going to have immigration, which I don't completely believe is a bad thing to do, it just needs to be controlled immigration, and that's what I was set down here to do. I'm only here because of Brexit. The people of Doncaster had had enough, and they wanted control of their borders. And unless we get control of their borders, Secretary of State, Ministers, unless we get control of their borders, we will not be coming back down here. I will not be coming back down here again. And the worst thing that... And you might cheer, but the people of Doncaster are not cheering because it's the first time they've had a Conservative MP to hold the Socialist Labour Council to account, who've been left to get away with murder for the last 60 years. It is absolutely atrocious. And so, I will back this bill. I will back it today. But we've got friends on this side of the House who want this bill stronger. And I'm going to work with them. I'm hopefully going to work with you. Because we must make this work. We have to stop the boats. It's what the Prime Minister has said, and I will back him until we don't. We must stop the boats. Thank you.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I feel like I've been sucked back in time to listen to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech again. I represent a multicultural constituency in Edinburgh South West with many immigrants, many asylum seekers, many refugees. And I can tell you that my constituents don't support this bill. I was stopped in the street by all sorts of people at the weekend telling me that they hoped I would make a speech against this bill because they find it repugnant. And the member who's just spoken perhaps needs to inform his constituents that the reason they live in the sort of conditions he describes and the reason they have such low wages is not because of immigration, but because of more than 10 years of Tory government. But anyway, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I intend to focus upon is the law, not as a lefty lawyer, but as somebody who tries to look like lawyers are bound to do, look dispassionately at the law. And if you listen to the public debate in the media anyway about this bill, you could be forgiven for thinking that the debate about the legality of the bill was confined to the competing tribes within the Conservative Party. Fortunately, it's not. And there are sources of advice independent of the government and independent of their querulous backbenchers. And it's on them that I want to focus. In particular, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, the Chair this morning, published a briefing based on the independent legal advice which has been given to the committee. That's independent legal advice to the committee for the benefit of all members of Parliament and peers. And that's why it's been published. I've also had occasion to consider the briefing published by the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. And they're both very important, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because the government are trying to position themselves as having stopped short of breaching international law. But what these briefings make clear, what these independent briefings make clear, is that the government haven't stopped short of breaching international law. The bill undermines the principles of the rule of law and the separation of powers, which are supposedly central to the British Constitution, as well as undermining various of our international obligations. And I would commend to honourable members reading the independent legal advice that's been given to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. I'm just going to take a few highlights from it. Requiring the courts to conclude that Rwanda is safe, even though the evidence has been assessed by the UK's highest court to establish that it is not, is a remarkable thing for a piece of legislation to do. If the government were so confident that Rwanda is suddenly safe and has suddenly become safe in the last month, as I said earlier in my intervention, why pass this bill at all? Another point in the Joint Committee on Human Rights legal analysis. Disapplying the Human Rights Act is very significant. If human rights protections are disapplied when they cause problems for a policy goal, they lose their fundamental and universal quality that characterises them. And this is arguably particularly the case when they are disapplied in respect of a particular group, in this case migrants who've come to the UK without prior permission. And in my own aside, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll just remind the House that history shows that withdrawing human rights from a particular group, when a country does that, it's on a particularly slippery slope. The Joint Committee on Human Rights, our independent legal advice, also makes it very clear that, crucially, no matter what the legislation says, it can affect only domestic law. And that was the point of my intervention in the Honourable Member for Stowe much earlier this afternoon. As the Supreme Court explained only a month ago, the United Kingdom is prohibited from allowing refoulement under the Refugee Convention and the ECHR, as well as under the UN Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All of these obligations are obligations to which we have signed up in international law. Passing this bill will not change the fact that we're signed up to those obligations in international law, and it won't change the fact that we are breaching our international legal obligations. So the members on the opposite benches, particularly the lawyers who've convinced themselves that it's okay to go through the lobbies and vote for the second reading of this bill tonight, are simply wrong. And if they look at the independent and legal advice from the JCHR and indeed from the Bingham Centre on the rule of law, they will see that that is the case. Yes, I will give way.
I thank my honourable friends for giving way. Isn't the fundamental part of the problem with this bill is that so many people see it as punishing the exploited and not the exploiter, and that if the government was serious about this issue, that's exactly what they would focus on?
Well, indeed, and it's been suggested by a number of speakers this afternoon that no alternatives have been suggested to this bill, but alternatives have been suggested. A serious attempt to break the model of the people smugglers. Proper international cooperation. Unfortunately, because of Brexit and because of the government's attitude towards international law, the United Kingdom's opportunities for international cooperation are becoming few and far between, because people don't trust us any longer and we don't have the same avenues for international cooperation as we used to have. Creating safe and legal routes. That's the way to do it. That's what we used to have. People who are seeking asylum are not seeking asylum illegally, but they come across the channel because they have no other way to seek asylum unless they come to the country. So create legal routes. I will in a moment, but I want to say something about how this bill impinges on Scotland. I want to make very clear that when members opposite talk about their mandate and their constituents wanting this bill, people in Scotland don't want this bill. It's not the approach that we want in Scotland. And so, therefore, it's particularly egregious that this bill seeks to oust the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts in relation to such fundamental matters as human rights and the basic tenets of our Constitution. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, Scotland's system of civil justice is a devolved matter under the Scotland Act, and therefore it's the preserve of the Scottish Parliament. Yet I don't see any legislative consent motion being sought, despite the fact that the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts is being ousted. Perhaps even more importantly, historically, and it's rather important to those of us who are Scots lawyers, the authority and privileges of the Court of Session, including its inherent supervisory jurisdiction, are protected by Article 19 of the Treaty of Union. And that includes the noble officium of the Court of Session, a a power that exists to give remedies where otherwise there would be no other remedy. And that's also arguably threatened by this bill. Now, I know the government's not terribly interested in Scotland, but I do wonder whether the government's applied its mind to whether there should have been a legislative consent motion here, and to whether this legislation is in breach of the Treaty of Union by ousting the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts. And I see the Minister looking at his notes. I'd be particularly interested to hear him answer those points in his sum-up. Thank you.
James Daly.
Much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I think after some of the contributions I must make reference to my register of members' interest as a lawyer, as a solicitor of nearly 20 years. And the one thing that has happened on every day of my working life through those 20 years is that every lawyer I've met disagrees with every other lawyer about the issue that's in front of them. And one of the things that I can guarantee is that your advice tends to be somewhat in line with the instruction from your client and the end that your client wants. And so some of the legal advice that has been referred to in this chamber and the sources it has come from, people may want to ponder in respect of that. In my time in this chamber, have been on the Justice Select Committee for 4 years. I'm on the Home Affairs Select Committee. I went with my honourable friend from Barrow, who's no longer in his place, and I will call my honourable friend from Hull over there, the chair of the Select Committee. We went to Calais on a trip, and we went on the beaches of Calais, and we spoke to people, and we saw what some may call a functioning asylum system or immigration system within France. That is not what I witnessed in the slightest. Calais is effectively a waiting room without any resources put into it, where people are directed as a waiting room to wait for a boat to come into the United Kingdom. Myself, my honourable friend, we saw that essentially the immigrants who are there are housed in tents. They are treated in the most appalling manner by the French authorities, and when the French authorities get fed up with them, they literally burn the tents down, physically attack the people who are there, and throw them onto the next area or field. So the idea that we have some outlier in terms of how we treat immigrants, the immigrants that come into our country, is for the birds. Too often in this chamber, and I think it's a point very well made by a number of my friends, is that we ignore the concerns of our own constituents to pontificate about how moral and how, shall we say, how, our sort of liberal conscience. Of course, yeah.
I thank him for giving way on that. Does he agree with me that that France is supposed to be a safe country, and people do have an option when they arrive in France or any other EU country that they can claim asylum in that first safe country? And when they actually make a decision to come over the channel, they make a decision to be illegal and get involved with criminal gangs. Nobody is forcing them to do that.
Thank you very much. I agree with my honourable friend in respect of that. And we've heard some statements here, blanket statements regarding immigration. But one of the curious things that I found when I was speaking to people with colleagues on the beaches was that all the people seeking immigration in this country were all males, were all single, were all of a certain age frame. There were virtually no females at all in any of the situations that we got taken to. And I think that we are escaping from both what our constituents want to do and the reality of what motivates people. People said to me when I was in those camps, we think, I'm paraphrasing here, but the basic point is, we think and we are told that the United Kingdom streets are laced with gold, that this is something that you are going to come in here, you're going to be provided with a lot of financial support, with it through benefits and other things, and that is what is motivating a vast majority of these people to come into this country. Now, in terms of the comments made by the benches opposite, you would think that nobody in the world is motivated by that to come in here. Yeah. Everyone is fleeing because they are fleeing some type of persecution. Utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. Our constituents expect us as a government, as a parliament, to put in place a suite of measures that is going to address the problem that is happening in the Channel. Yeah. This, as my honourable friend, many honourable friends have said, is one of a number of measures this government is taking. This government should be congratulated for that. Yeah. And as my honourable friend from Barrow said, nobody seems to pick this point up. The French authorities said to us when we were there that a deterrent effect, a deterrent policy, the Rwanda policy, is absolutely necessary. And we saw And the French authorities saw, when this policy was first announced, and it was thought that when people were going and were potentially coming over the channel, they saw a drop in cases. The spike only came when it became clear that through various legal means that this policy was not going to go forward. So not only do the French authorities think that we need a deterrent, not only are countries such as Germany, the US, Italy, Austria all saying that we need some type of policy and following the United Kingdom's lead, this is what our constituents want. We cannot have a situation where we cannot house people, where people cannot get doctor's appointments, where people can't afford a house. We can't have a situation where we have, and this may be acceptable to honourable members opposite, where we have in our prison system 10,000 foreign national offenders in our prison system. We have to take measures which reflect the will of the people, not the will of middle-class liberal consciences, which are essentially, sometimes I feel like it is more important, I think, for some to moralise than to actually be concerned about what motivates their constituents and what we should be doing in this place. In terms of the objections that I've heard to this bill, I've heard two set out, and the two ones are one in relation to Section 39 injunctions, and I would ask my honourable friend a point in respect to that, because I agree completely with my honourable friend from Devon West and Torridge. Can I ask him to comment on the government's own legal advice? Because technically, Part 39 injunctions, the government can ignore those. That is, you know, what he's saying. So my honourable friend may be able to tell me something different. But I think that's an important part of this bill, and if he could comment on that, I would be very grateful. The second part, and I'm not quite sure, because I respect every single contribution that's been made on these ventures, is I cannot think that anyone, and I've certainly not read any legal advice that thinks that we should exclude the right of appeal, or the right of, in extreme circumstances, the right to challenge whether you are being taken to a foreign country. And there must be circumstances. Even the Star Chamber advice says that there must be at least some form of allowance in respect to that. And so I think that the legal test that the government have been put in place, compelling evidence that somebody must show that there is compelling evidence they would suffer serious and immeasurable harm, is a strong test. I think it is going to address both legally and practically everything that our constituents want us to do. This is a good policy. It's a policy the government have worked hard to refine. It is within the bounds of international law. It is within the bounds of what this government has undertaken to the country, which is to tackle illegal migration and to stop boats crossing the channel.
5-minute limit now. Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to a priest in my constituency who recently brought to my attention the film Man for All Seasons, which I confess I'd never seen. There's a quote in it which I think is very relevant. Some men think the earth is round, others think it flat. It's a matter capable of question, but if it is flat, will the king command make it round? And if it is round, will the king's command flatten it? The proposition we have today seeks us to accept the fact that government can simply define facts as facts, even if they are not so. The attempt to bend our entire legal system to fit the will of government is a high price to pay for some meagre political cover for a party that promised to deal with a genuine issue, and I think those across the House would agree with that it is a genuine issue, and has singularly failed to do so. Now we see, and we've seen it before us in the past 5.5 hours, the Prime Minister appeasing his right flank with promises of amendments later in order to bring some people on side, and others debating the fact that those very amendments would pull them away from supporting the bill. It's a complete mess playing out before us. And what a distance this Tory party has come. Their former leader, now brought back from the wilderness, as Lord Cameron said only a decade ago, "I believe that immigration has brought significant benefits to Britain. This is our island story, open, diverse and welcoming, and I'm immensely proud of it." And from that, we get to the repugnant rhetoric of the member from Don Valley, one of the most appalling speeches I've ever heard, and he's not in his place, but it was a shameful speech. The spectacle of an immigration minister resigning from his post, not in protest at the government's novel policy, but because it doesn't go far enough, and speech after speech on that side of members criticising the bill, but then saying they're going to support it. But perhaps more important than any of the legal challenges is the moral case for why this bill must be blocked. And I take issue with the idea that we shouldn't think of any of the morality of these issues. We talk of planes and boats and targets and backlogs and forget that these are human beings seeking shelter and a better life. Indeed, the Home Office's own statistics show that at least 6 out of 10 of those who made the dangerous Channel crossing will be recognised as refugees in the asylum process. And given that many are fleeing extreme situations to embark on one of the most extreme routes possible, how can this possibly stand as any kind of deterrent?
Will my honourable friend give way on that?
I will. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that those who support refugees in our country deserve our respect and should be commended by the House for their excellent work supporting refugees and local communities up and down this land?
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend that, of course, immigrants across this country have contributed so much over decades to the country that we enjoy today, and we should give them immense thanks, not least in our public services. Mr Deputy Speaker, instead of thinking of other solutions to deal with the criminal gangs that are causing such misery and death as they smuggle people across the Channel, they've decided to hold firm to a course of action that's already cost us hundreds of millions of pounds and which we've heard throughout the debate tonight will cost us even more. Instead of challenging the criminal gangs at source and building better cooperation with our European neighbours to tackle it, with a government fixated on a plan that the Home Secretary himself doesn't even seem particularly convinced by. And for what? A law that's unlikely to even succeed at the aims that it's put forward. The assumption made in this bill is not that Rwanda is a safe country, but that all decision makers must treat it as such. In other words, they have to put aside any reality that they may know and accept for the purpose of decision making that Rwanda is a safe country. There will be no recourse to appeal on the basis that someone removed to Rwanda may be sent to another country, even if it could be demonstrated that that's a genuine possibility. No recourse to appeal on the basis that a person may not receive fair consideration of their asylum claim, because the government's decided that these things are all safe. These provisions mean that only in exceptional personal circumstances would an individual have a means of legally challenging the decision. This is a deeply unsettling proposition. A government removing one of the key components of constitutional democracy, the right of any citizen to test any law in an independent court. Never could this be more important than on an issue of human rights. And the question of parliamentary sovereignty itself has already been clarified. Lord Hope stated parliamentary sovereignty is no longer, if it ever was, absolute. It's no longer right to say that freedom to legislate admits no qualification whatsoever. The bill leaves open the possibility of individual challenge to the ECHR, and we heard from a number of members today that actually that might indeed be the point at which we're back here a few months from now discussing this very issue again with a government withdrawing us from the ECHR. Mr Deputy Speaker, until a few months ago I was in the classroom teaching pupils, amongst other things, how to identify truth from sources of information. We told young people there is such a thing as objective truth. And yet here I am, in the so-called Mother of Parliaments, faced with a morally reprehensible and legally questionable farce. A charade that even, I suspect, most of the people who will eventually be persuaded to go through the iLobby tonight don't actually endorse. And at the heart of it is the idea that a government can simply state what is true, even if the evidence points the other way. It's for this House tonight to challenge the government's shoddy attempt at doing so, and to do the right thing by voting down this law.
Mayhew.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to start by looking at the founding principles of this bill. But I think it's worth remembering that it actually tries to do what our constituents want us to do. So that's not a bad start for any bill at second reading. When I knock on doors, which I do week in, week out, I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands, of my constituents over the last few years. Without question, the single most common issue raised in those conversations is illegal migration. So we, in this place, we owe them an absolute duty to do our very best to deliver on their wishes to produce an effective control to migration and also to illegal migration. And that's what this bill intends to do, to provide an effective deterrent that breaks the business model and will lead to stopping the votes, not by itself. It's not an isolated policy. It's part of a whole suite of policies which this government, to its enormous credit, has introduced over the last years and which is already bearing fruit. We have seen this year crossings by small boats down by a third, I think it's slightly over a third, at a time when they're going up by a third in Europe as a whole and by 80% in the Mediterranean countries. So the schemes which the government has come up with and has already implemented are working. And they include bilateral agreements with countries such as Albania, a dedication of a safe country status, which is not novel to this bill. That's had an immediate deterrent effect. It's not that everyone who's come to this country has then been immediately deported to Albania. That hasn't been the deterrent effect. It's the fact that they know that they will be, but they've stopped coming in the first place. Crossings by Albanians have dropped by 90+%. Yes. And that's why Rwanda is so important. It's not that the capacity of Rwanda has to accept every single migrant that currently comes across the channel. It's the deterrent effect to stop them coming in the first place. And we've seen it working. So why not follow the evidence? We've also got the upstream destruction of equipment. Just last week, I understand, there was a Bulgarian seizure of boats and engines and engine parts, preventing the ability to cross over the channel. And there's increased cooperation with France, which I wholeheartedly welcome, which has led to increased coastal patrols and an increased interdiction of attempts to cross the channel, although not all of them. There's been a 70% increase of raids on illegal employment in this country, and there's been an enormous increase, which I very much welcome, in the number of claims handlers to speed the process of assessment, bringing down the backlog from 90,000 to below 20,000 now. So Rwanda, the Rwanda scheme, this bill is important, but it's just one tool of many. So let's be clear what the real dispute is in this chamber today. It's not about the intentions on this side of the House. We are united in wanting an effective policy for Rwanda. Where the real dispute is, every single member on this House, on these benches, we are entirely united on that objective. It's how we get there that we're debating. What we see on the other side is we want an effective deterrent. They do not want an effective deterrent. Labour and the Liberal Democrats don't. They want to scrap it, even if the Rwanda policy is demonstrated to be working. They have committed to replacing it. We want flights to take off to Rwanda, as do our constituents. They want to prevent it. We want to restore control over our asylum processes. Labour and the Liberal Democrats say the only policy is to hire more staff. Hire another 100,000. Have safe and legal routes. That was raised, and that is important. I accept that. But that does not answer the question of how many people come over in the safe and legal routes. We can have a process which welcomes everyone, but the United Nations tell us there are 108 million people in the world at the moment who have been displaced by violence from their own country. So safe and legal routes is a great cliche, it's a great strap word, but it does not solve the problem of control of our borders. So this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, it responds to the Supreme Court judgment. It doesn't say that black is white. It doesn't say that the risk of refoulement then was a false decision by the House of Lords. It solves the problem by an international treaty preventing refoulement, and that in the very rare occasions where Rwanda may wish to export to a third country, they come back to the United Kingdom. That is sensible. That's not going against the Supreme Court. It is respecting their judgment and solving the problems which the Supreme Court raised, as they said in their judgment. And I wholeheartedly support this second reading.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's been some absurd and ridiculous bills presented to this Parliament in the course of the past few centuries that's been in existence, but it would be hard to find a bill that is more absurd and ridiculous than this particular bill. A bill that wills something to be just because it wants it and asks us to ignore reality and experience because it decrees it is just about as absurd and ridiculous as you can get. And it takes some imagination to concoct something as comedically callous as this. And it would take a particularly warped mind to actually think that this type of rendition is a solution to anything far less a sensitive and complex immigration problem. And I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been totally dispiriting listening to some of the contributions for honourable gentlemen and ladies from across the bench. The dehumanising language, the talk of invasions and cultural wars, treating people as commodities to be dealt with, as scourges to be legaled away. It has been absolutely appalling. And I'll single out two speeches which I think are absolutely and utterly appalling, and that was a disgraceful speech from the honourable member from Don Valley, followed in quick succession by the former Home Secretary, the member for Newark. And I will say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is hasn't Rwanda played an absolute blinder? They must have seen them coming from thousands of miles away, soliciting hundreds of millions of pounds from this government, and apparently they're going to get another £100 million more. But they've done all this without taking one single deportee. Go Rwanda, you have made utter mugs of this chaotic government across the road. And nobody's won from the southern Rwanda, certainly not the wretched people who are going to be subject to this ongoing problem with getting onto these boats at the mercy of all these dreadful people who smuggle people across the channel. This will do nothing to disincentivise them. If they're prepared to risk their life to come across this channel, why are they going to concern themselves with the infinitesimal chance that they might be rendered to Rwanda? It just does not make sense. And it certainly hasn't helped them, has it? I mean, I don't know if they're going to win this vote tonight, and partly it's still in the balance if that's news for honourable colleagues across the bench. I think they might just about have got it, but apparently it's still in the balance. And look at the list of all the different groups that we have. There's the One Nation group, the European Research Group, the New Conservatives, the Common Sense Group. I'd love to go to one of their meetings. The Northern Research Group, the No Turning Back Group, the Conservative Growth Group, a group of factions that would make the People's Front of Judea look like a model of unity and political consensus. And this might be the very bill that would bring down this Conservative government. And what a hill to die on. An obsession with immigration, an obsession with stopping these small boats. And by God, they deserve to be brought down if this is a bill that's going to determine this. But here's a novel idea, Madam Deputy Speaker. Why don't we start to consider immigration as some sort of opportunity and potential boost to our society and community? Why don't we design safe and secure means to harness international talent that seeks to flee conflict and carnage in their own country? We live in a world where the movement of peoples has never been so far-reaching and so profound. And one thing that the honourable member from Newark said is that this is going to be an ongoing feature of the international community. This is going to be something that we'll have to deal with, not just for this decade, but for the rest of the century. Can we not be imaginative about solutions? Can we not look to see if there's benefits to be given by people who are the cream of their countries coming to this nation? Are we all about stopping borders, stopping people coming here, making life as miserable for the poor souls that manage to end up on our shores? I'm just pleased that this is not in my name. It is not in the name of the people of Scotland. And if we ever were in control of our immigration policy, everything that they're proposing and presenting would be the exact opposite of what we would do. Scotland rejects this. My constituents want nothing to do with this. I will proudly and defiantly be voting against this evening, and that will be in the name of the people that I represent, and I know that I will be joined by colleagues. What a disgraceful bill. What an appalling piece of legislation. It deserves to be shoved right in the furthest bin from the furthest corner of this country.
Just to advise colleagues that I will be starting the wind-ups at 6:30. Kevin Foster.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's somewhat comic to get a lecture on unity and financial probity from the Scottish National Party, to say the least. But, you know, well, if we really want something comic. But this bill is one that I do welcome seeing come forward, and in particular the fact that it was obviously myself, the right honourable member for Witham and the right honourable member for Corby, who were sort of the original architects of the Rwanda plan. And a lot of that's because we face the challenge in this country that other countries in Europe do, which is namely that there are countries where even if we turn down someone's asylum claim, we will struggle to return them too. So, for example, there are countries around the world that we would not wish to deal with those governments, or there are countries which, as a point-blank matter of policy, refuse to accept enforced immigration returns. In fact, there's some countries we even struggle to deport criminals back to them due to domestic policy, not necessarily due to concerns about the country, due to the domestic policies they adopt. Because this was touched on in a speech by a member actually opposite. You cannot just drop people off. You need to get the permission to do so. And similarly, if we cannot get a returns agreement with the safe and democratic third country that they have just left, then we need to look at what is an alternative. And that's why then looking to Rwanda came in. Rwanda is a country that is a specialist in refugee resettlement. Hearing some of the comments from opposite, you'd never know that there's 130,000 refugees in Rwanda. You wouldn't know that UNHCR relocates people to Rwanda. And if that shows they are specialists in this area. That is one of the reasons we worked with this country. And in terms of looking at the Supreme Court's recent ruling, the Supreme Court's ruling was not based on the idea that Rwanda was inherently unsafe. It wasn't based on the idea that if someone went to Rwanda, they'd actually be in danger in Rwanda. It was what was the potential for refoulement elsewhere. I expect many of the people citing the Supreme Court judgment probably didn't bother to listen to it. And that's why it's important to look at what does this bill, and what is this bill based on? What has changed since the Supreme Court judgment that allows Parliament to take a different view to what the Supreme Court justices took, and not just on the fact that, as the member for Torridge and West Devon rightly pointed out, Parliament is quite entitled to do that, but it's based on the fact that there is now a treaty that directly addresses those points, and this bill actually ratifies that treaty, makes it part of international law that guarantees against someone who goes to Rwanda, transferred from this country, for Rwanda to meet their protection needs rather than this country. So that means they will not then be transferred further on. That is the absolute core of what has changed since the Supreme Court judgment. It is why Parliament is now quite entitled to take an opinion that Rwanda is a country that is both safe in terms of people being transferred there, based on the assurances we've got that will be upgraded into international law via a treaty, and based on the clear assurances against refoulement to a third country where someone may face persecution. And that's why I do think this bill does need to get a second reading. There are clearly points of detail that we can explore at committee, and particularly the ministers on the front bench, both of which I've got huge respect for, will know my thoughts around making sure, what is going to be, particularly in the clause 4, where is the evidence threshold going to be? Particularly interesting to hear, particularly given his former role as Solicitor General, his experience in front of the courts directly, where he believes the courts may draw the line for interim relief. And one reason why interim relief is always quite important is many cases, a lot of the challenges thrown up at the last minute usually fail in the end. But what they're used for is to frustrate the actual flight. Particularly when I used to deal with things like the Jamaica flights. We could only have so many a year. So you knew if you could get yourself off that flight, it would be some time before there was another one, even if your claim ultimately fell. Now, there is a wider debate to have around the refugee system. There's a debate to have around how the current law and current international practice works. We can see people, we've had examples of people who've lived in the European Union for a number of years with a visa, living there lawfully, and then come to the UK and claim they have a protection need. Well, if you've been living in a safe and democratic European country, what was your real protection need for leaving that country, particularly if you had the lawful right to be there? But those debates are not debates we can settle today. What we have before us is a bill that allows us to take forward part of our plan to tackle the issues of illegal migration. And this is why we need to make sure it gets a second reading this evening.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have to say, we've heard the sounds of optimism over truth coming on from the opposite side. This idea that this is a deterrent has not yet been proven. It has been cited as though it's actively deterring people from arriving in the boats. And we all know that the boats is a challenge, and it's a real problem because people are dying in the Channel. But let's be clear, this was the government that was the architect of this. This is the second time to legislate on this, and we've had the architects stand up, including the Honourable Member for Torbay just now, proud that they drew this up, but drew it up so badly that they're having to revisit the legislation. So I think they're a bit less proud, and frankly, proper policy making, even though I don't agree with this policy, is that you make it work before you announce it. And in fact, there's so many flaws in this that they're struggling along and believe that a headline and a pledge that this will deter people is enough. And that's not good policy making. And we've often been challenged what we would do differently on this side. Well, the honourable member for Birmingham Hodge Hill and I were at that front line dealing with immigration matters in the last Labour government, and it was the honourable member for Birmingham Hodge Hill who was the architect of a system that meant that one person every 8 minutes was being returned. And we all know there is an issue where people who do actually, people come to my constituency, they've reached the end of the line, they know it. We talk about voluntary return, and yet it is really difficult to do that when the Home Office doesn't return your documents and you've got all of those problems. So these are people who actively want to leave because they know that's the only option now for them, and they can't do it. I mean, this government has got to look much better at the existing system that it's working. It is 13 years of downgrading the asylum system, the immigration system generally, and now all those extra people have gone into dealing with the backlog of asylum cases, of which there are 20,000 legacy cases still left. And was it the 13th of December the Prime Minister said it would get to zero? Well, he's missed that target, and there's 160,000 of people who've been backing up in the asylum system. Plus, in my constituency, all of those people, including a top surgeon, people coming in on work permits, people on student visas, all behind in the queue because all of the Home Office effort is going into the Prime Minister's pledge to deal with the backlog. So you're just creating more chaos in the entire system, and that is not working. But my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull, touched on the money, and of course on the Public Accounts Committee we have been trying to look at the money on this issue. I won't go through the figures because she has already said them, but in a 5-year plan, and we have no figures for how much money will go to Rwanda in years 4 and 5. We asked the Permanent Secretary, both myself and the Right Honourable Lady and other members of the Public Accounts Committee yesterday. He would not be forthcoming on that figure, and he only released a figure to us when it was leaked to the International Monetary Fund by some, the investigations happening about why that was. That is a ridiculous way, and it is not normal parliamentary protocol to release information about major projects, especially when we're voting on them in this House, in the annual report and accounts. Just to give some colleagues who may not follow with the same enthusiasm as members of the Public Accounts Committee, the annual accounts of departments, the accounts for the financial year we're in will be published to Parliament July of next year. 15 months after the £100 million was allocated this year. That is not scrutiny. What we have with other areas, and I look at the Minister to answer on this point, or take it back to the Home Secretary, is other projects. We will get 6 monthly or even more frequent updates to the House, through committees or laid in the House, and that is not uncommon, and yet his Permanent Secretary was saying it's a normal way to do it just through the accounts. We need to see more scrutiny of this issue. If it's a flagship government policy, there is nothing to hide, so let us see those figures, and we, as both our sister committees, will work together on that issue. So it is really important we do that. And we need to tackle the backlog, we need transparency on the numbers. And I would also be grateful if the Minister could be clear if there are any conditions attached to the money going to Rwanda. We got a useful breakdown from the Permanent Secretary and Committee yesterday, which I won't repeat, but it's on the record from the committee meeting yesterday. But is there anything that if the Rwandans spent it on would be out of order? So what it spent on was reasonable things like education, health and so on. But is there anything that the Rwandans cannot spend, the money that's given to them by the UK? It would be very helpful to know that. And also there was an expression of interest in a contract for Manston and Western Jetfoil. This is a £700 million contract for the first 6 years of this. Could extend to be worth £1.16 billion over 10 years. And this is money to improve those reception centres, which definitely need improving. But the facilities are expected to be active, according to that pre-tender document, between 2030 and 2034. So I'm a bit puzzled. If there's an awful £700 million being invested in Manston and Western Jetfoil, welcome though that, necessary though that may be, and yet we've been told all afternoon, I've been here for 5.5 hours, we've been told all afternoon that it's already deterring people. So if it's working so well, why is there the same need then to invest that much money in these facilities? It needs the investment, but it seems to me that the government is trying to have it both ways, and I would welcome clarity from the Minister.
Duncan Baker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will support this bill this evening because it is a fundamental right that a country must be able to protect its borders, and as a basic, it should know who is entering the country, and even more so if they are trying to do it illegally. And I support the bill because we simply can't rest on our laurels with the current action we have taken, as positive as that already is. We've heard it this afternoon that all across Europe, major European countries have seen illegal migration rising, 80% up in Mediterranean crossings. And yet, thanks to the steps that we have taken in this country, our numbers are down by a third. Now, people quote a third over and over again. But what does that mean? It's approximately 17,000 people down on where it was last year. And that is way down on the forecasts, which were expecting it to potentially double on where the numbers were last year.
Yep.
But reducing the figure and being happy with 29,000 people this year isn't stopping the problem. Stopping people being put on boats and trying to illegally enter the country requires a multifaceted approach. Return agreements have worked. Putting our border force into French control rooms has worked. And trying to dry up the supply of rubber boats has also worked. But there has to be a deterrent as well. It is simply another piece of the jigsaw, and on top of all of the other measures that we are using. And for those who seem not to be able to understand why we need that deterrent, I pose a simple question. Don't look at the situation today. Look at the tens of thousands that are crossed this year. Look through the lens of where that situation is going with migration around the world. If we don't tackle it today with a strong working deterrent, then we won't see tens of thousands of people trying to cross into the country. We will see hundreds of thousands of people trying to cross into the country. And that is the forecast that we are being shown year after year. The government's official release yesterday was the most startling statistic I've read yet. It estimates that if illegal immigration goes unaddressed, the cost of asylum and accommodation alone could increase to £32 million per day by 2026, equivalent to £11 billion a year. £11 billion a year. Just imagine how that could be used on our public services. So the government is absolutely right to use every power it has at its disposal to prevent and deter unlawful migration. And to the people who have said we've spent an unbelievable amount of money already, 250 million, should I say, in trying to get this scheme up and running, that figure pales into insignificant amounts when you put it in the context of 11 billion a year, as I've just read out. Our NHS, our housing provision and our welfare state, indeed all of our public services, simply cannot take unsustainable levels of illegal migration. Now, I am not a lawyer, and there are all manner of opinions on whether the scheme will work or not. But my answer to that is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Fair enough, as it has been said already this afternoon, it may not stop every single legal challenge, and that's fair enough. Some of those will be valid, and it doesn't have to. What it does need to be is a deterrent to help and stop and slow down the numbers that are coming. And that is why, when there is plenty of commentary on this bill, there is plenty in this to stop the spurious reasons of not taking people and being sent for asylum in Rwanda. And when I read that the UN and the EU alone have been sending refugees to Rwanda since 2019, I find it extremely difficult to understand that actually people have accused Rwanda of not being a safe country. Sure, we have to tread a fine line to have an operable bill, and one that is fair and one that international partners will stand alongside. Plenty of times I've been told in this House things will not happen, things will not work. We were told we wouldn't get the numbers of boats crossings down. We have by a third. Everybody said we would enter a recession. We didn't enter a recession. Everybody said that we wouldn't halve inflation. We have halved inflation. This government has done many things in the last year which we were told were simply unachievable, and we have achieved them, and that's why we'll back this bill tonight.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, last week my honourable friend the member for Glasgow Central compared the Home Secretary to Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland, who uses words to mean just what he chooses them to mean. I wonder if perhaps the Prime Minister could be compared to the Red Queen, who believed 6 impossible things before breakfast. that Brexit has been a success, that Britain is a soft power superpower, that the Scottish Parliament is the most powerful devolved assembly in the entire world, that we can reach net zero while abandoning net zero policies, or that this bill is actually going to stop irregular arrivals in the United Kingdom, or sixthly, that his party is actually going to win the next election. But I think even for that side of the House, that is too unbelievable. They don't think this bill is going to work, and they don't think they're going to win the next election. And the bill isn't going to work because it fails under the crushing weight of its own internal contradictions. Rwanda is deemed to be a safe country, desirable even as a place for asylum seekers to be processed and to remain. And the former Home Secretary didn't take my intervention earlier on. I wanted to ask her, if Rwanda is such a desirable place to be deported to, why on earth should it be a deterrent? How is it going to have a deterrent effect if the government saying this is a wonderful, safe and secure place for you to go? Maybe more people will come to the United Kingdom in the hope of being sent to Rwanda. The Republic of Rwanda is to be trusted to fulfil its obligation. I'm very happy to give way.
For giving way on this, because I think he must recognise that Rwanda has successfully resettled over 130,000 people, and that's through international institutions and norms.
Yes, so
Honourable gentleman to keep within the 5 minutes. He's taken an intervention, but Patrick Graves.
So I think I've just heard the former Home Secretary encouraging more people to come to the United Kingdom so that they can be safely settled in Rwanda. And the Republic of Rwanda is to be trusted to fulfil its obligations under the Rwanda Treaty because the treaty is binding under customary international law. But the same bill grants the UK Government derogations from that corpus of international law and instructs the courts to ignore it. And the bill is supposed to slash costs to the taxpayer of housing asylum seekers in UK hotels, but the government has already paid Rwanda hundreds of millions of pounds without a single flight taking off. And the price for this performative weak bill is a weakening of the courts and judicial system, a weakening of the UK's standing in the world, and indeed a weakening of the entire system of international law. Because if it's okay for the UK government to derogate from its international obligations and commitments when it suits, then how can the UK object to other countries, Russia or China or anywhere else for that matter, when they flaunt the rule of international law? The bill is supposed to be an assertion of parliamentary sovereignty, as if Parliament asserting particular statements simply makes them true. Well, to pick up on the theme from the member for Rutherglen who spoke earlier, perhaps then the Prime Minister should have simply brought forward a flat earth bill to assert that the earth is flat and the Home Office is empowered to simply push people and unwanted asylum seekers off the edge of it and into the cold vastness of space. Now, it might come as a surprise and perhaps even a disappointment to some elements of the Conservative backbenchers, but the earth is not flat. The earth is round, and if you keep pushing people in one direction, eventually they will come back to you. Now, it's important in all of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be clear that despite us debating the safety of Rwanda bill, very little of this debate is actually about the safety of Rwanda. In 2018, I had the huge privilege of visiting Rwanda with the CPA. It's a beautiful country, it has huge potential, and the people there have had to live through horrors and overcome unimaginable difficulties. But for wealthy tourists and those who fly in to go on safari and stay in nice hotels, Rwanda is indeed a safe and welcoming country. But for citizens who speak up too loudly with questions about the regime, who perhaps ask why international observers have been unable to report that presidential elections have been free or fair, or perhaps people who belong to the LGBT+ community in that country, or indeed if there are Rwandan citizens who live in London under the protection of the Metropolitan Police because they're being sought by their own country's intelligence services, perhaps they might not find it as safe and welcoming. And whatever the bill might say, the UK Supreme Court has made a finding of fact that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda are at risk of refoulement, and simply saying they're not doesn't change that fact. Really, though, the question of the safety of Rwanda is a distraction. The very principle or idea of forcing people to move to another country, to any other country, against their will, should be enough to oppose the government's policies. People seeking asylum have chosen to come here to the United Kingdom for good reason, perhaps because they have friends or family, or perhaps simply, yes, because they do speak the language. But if someone has chosen to seek asylum here, they should be assessed here, and if their claim is valid, they should be allowed to remain. And if their claim isn't valid, then by definition, it ought to be safe to return them to their country of origin. Perhaps the most remarkable thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this time last week, week. This bill didn't even exist. In less than 7 days, the Prime Minister has brought himself, and possibly his government and party, to a crisis point entirely of their own making. It's a bill that nobody wants and nobody likes. It's another creaking internal Conservative contradiction. Too extreme for the mainstream of the party, not extreme enough for the Red Wallers, the ERG and the Maastricht rebels who simply can't get enough of the sweet dopamine hit that comes with rebelling against the party and getting invited onto all kinds of podcasts. Some of them have been at it since the 1990s and they just have to keep getting more extreme in their rebellions to achieve the same hit. Well, Scotland wants none of it, Madam Deputy Speaker. The constituents I hear from in Glasgow North, and the constituents, indeed, who are refugees, want to play a full and active part in our society and economy. If the government wants bills that will change the actual reality of the situation, they can devolve the power over immigration to the Scottish Parliament, or they can give us the chance to choose a better, fairer future that respects human rights and global citizenship by becoming an independent country in a referendum.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say it's a pleasure to follow the member for Glasgow North who served on the Westminster Foundation with me. But he did rehash quite a lot of what was said on the benches opposite, with various misunderstandings and inaccuracies, and had his moment of fun trying to describe different groups of colleagues on this side. But let me pull him back to something that he will recognise, as I think all colleagues in this House will. A conversation I had with a distinguished, recently retired UN senior official, and previous to that, British ambassador in several countries in Africa. And he not only painted for me, but also described for me factually the statistical possibilities of what is going on in that great continent in the moment. And he described vividly the combination of civil wars, mismanagement, instability, insecurity, climate change challenges and food shortages, which are affecting millions of people in Africa. And of course we know that is also added to the incredible level of insecurity in the Middle East and indeed further east from there as well. So all of this actually amounts, Madam Deputy Speaker, to one of the great challenges for democracy in our time, because we are dealing with a huge issue that is going to get bigger, and we are all going to be stretched in what our answers to those challenges are. It is not just us in the United Kingdom, as we know. There are issues happening in the Netherlands, Hungary, Italy, France, Denmark, France, you name it. All our European neighbours are wrestling with similar challenges. And therefore it is simply not enough for members of the opposition to point at various things that they don't like about this bill without really considering what a constructive alternative might look like. When, for example, the member for Edinburgh East said earlier that immigration should be looked at as an opportunity to be seized, not a problem to be managed, he is right in part, but he would be more convincing if county after county in Scotland were taking more asylum seekers now and putting up their hand to the government of the United Kingdom in order to take more. Because the truth is that it is, of course, also a challenge to be managed. So, as part of a practical response, because we do not outsource immigration to people smugglers, the point of stopping the boats and the point of the Rwanda Safety Bill is to have, in effect, a trailblazing role to play, not just for us, but for other countries. Because on balance, I believe that we will see more of such agreements rather than this being the only one. And while I've always taken the view that none of us can be sure that the Rwanda scheme will work in terms of the numbers of asylum seekers who will transfer to Kigali, keeping an open mind and not assuming, to quote the Labour amendment today, that this won't work to tackle smuggling gangs, won't work to end small boat crossings, won't work to achieve the core purposes of the bill, while only applying to less than 1% of those who claim asylum, is fundamentally wrong. And we can show that in a number of different ways. The first one is, will it actually act as a deterrent? Well, Migration Watch says it will be a powerful deterrent if illegal migrants are swiftly and continually sent to Rwanda. So how many would we be able to send? Well, the Rwanda spokesman himself said only a few days ago that we are ready and willing to take in as many people as the UK is able to send. So for all those people on the other side who talked about 100 or 200 people going, that is not at all the potential of this scheme. And as other people have mentioned, I'm sorry, I can't take any intervention. As other people have mentioned, Rwanda is already hosting 130,000 asylum seekers, and UNHCR itself has 1,700 Libyans there. So clearly the numbers are not the fundamental issue with this proposal.
That's correct.
So in terms of what has been raised by others, we've had a lot of red herring sound bites about can't work, won't work, unprecedented. No, there are precedents. And in fact, the Labour Party know this better than anyone, because the Mother of the House, the Right Honourable Member for Pakenham and Camberwell in 2001, was in a very similar position in not being able to confirm to the EHRC that we were necessarily compliant as a government in a proposal that she was putting forward. We know that the Blair government talked to Tanzania about something similar as part of the Nationalities Act of that time. And in fact, the Nationalities Act of 2022 built on the Asylum and Immigration Act of 2004. So there are some precedents. There are reasons to believe this might work. It is going to be awkward, and it is going to have to be an issue that we and many other governments tackle. But the most important thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we should get behind this bill and see it through safely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Rwanda is not a safe country. This country is using the bill as a distraction from their failing to sort out the immigration backlog. Millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is being spent on hotels every day. Hundreds of millions have now been spent on this fantasy Rwanda policy without a single person being sent there. Money would be better well spent sorting out the backlog and getting people processed. There are already immigration policies in place. They aren't being enforced. The Home Office is working too slowly, as they have done previously with passports. Processing claims quicker is the best way to free up these hotels. Over the past decade, the backlog of asylum claims has risen 4 times faster than the numbers claiming asylum. This is ultimately a crisis of the government's own making, your benches, and one that has been years in the making. It is a failing system that needs fixing. This country needs a solution to this crisis, not a distraction to it. This bill is claiming Rwanda is a safe country because the bill says that is so. That is not the type of country Britain is. We are not like that. We people, we believe in the rule of law and obligation to international laws and treaties. The Rwanda government, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been involved in many questionable events across Africa, including the kidnapping and beating of dissidents abroad. The Rwanda policy is an attempt by the government to look tough and to distract the country from the sorry state that they've got us in. Even on the off chance the flights to Rwanda take off, they will deal with less than 1% of asylum claims. It is a Tory vanity project. It won't solve any problem. As a country, we are better than this. Labour's plan to tackle the criminal gangs directly with a cross-border police unit and clearing the backlog is the only way to stop the small boats. Vanity projects for headlines are not befitting a serious issue like we've got. The government should go back to the drawing board, and we'll be here in a few months and a year, I'll bet. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
There are sometimes some advantages to being the last speaker, and because the previous speaker was a little shorter, I shall lift the time limit as long as the Honourable Lady sits down at 6:30. Claire Hannon.
I appreciate it's been a long day, a long debate. Perhaps the government could legislate a few extra hours for us all. It wouldn't be out of place with this pretty mind-bending bill from a government who continue to prioritise prejudice over objective reality. The member for East Antrim proposed to speak for my constituency of South Belfast, which does indeed have a relatively large, and I think the largest per head of population portion of the UK's asylum seekers, with our schools and our churches and our community groups trying valiantly to support people who the Home Office have left in hotels for many, many months at a time. Like me, those constituents have moral and practical objections to this bill, moral objections to the language being used to frame and to justify it, and to the demonisation of those who seek international protection in the UK, who have little or no opportunity to do that before they travel. Equally, they have practical objections to this bill because they know that it won't work. They know that there's no evidence that the deterrent works, a fact confirmed by the Permanent Secretary. Then they know that it relies on simplification by this government that implies that people have never met or spoken to an asylum seeker. The cost of this gimmick is now running into the hundreds of millions of pounds, money which could and should have been used instead to end the chaos of processing in the Home Office, or going after the people traffickers instead of bettering their market by closing off safe routes. No one is saying that the UK can or should take everyone who requires sanctuary for reasons of conflict or prejudice or climate. As everybody in this chamber knows, no matter what they say in their tweets, only a fraction of people try. No one is saying the UK shouldn't take legal steps to deter erroneous claims. The Minister has spoken about fruitful engagement with Albania. Honourable friends on these benches have set out numerous constructive proposals, including swifter processing and justice, and crucially modern and mature engagement with neighbouring countries. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's impossible to view this bill outside of two core dynamics. One is the UK's recent disregard of international law, a rules-based order that they previously and proudly shaped. And the second is the dynamic of overall irrational opposition to migration, including regular migration. People often say that you can't even talk about immigration. You absolutely can talk about immigration, but you have to be prepared to be honest about it and to trade in more than just Twitter memes. You have to be prepared to talk about how the National Health Service and social care would collapse without it. You have to be honest about the net positive impact on GDP and about the poor political decisions and how we spend those gains that have left public services in the mess they are. You have to be honest about our higher education model and the higher fees that students from these areas and from countries here would face if we didn't have overseas students. You have to be honest about how it is anti-family to tell UK citizens that they can't fall in love with somebody and marry them from another country unless they're in the top 25% of earners. So of course you can talk about immigration. I'm happy to talk about immigration, and I'm happy to tell you that Northern Ireland has an immigration problem, and that problem is young people leaving our region to make their lives elsewhere because they feel stifled and limited by the politics of our region, by intolerance, by prejudice and by refusal to accept difference. And I warn you that Britain risks losing its vibrancy and losing its talent if it further goes down this path, a path that I am glad to say the mainstream of British politics have honourably resisted, mostly until now. Ireland's not immune, north or south, from these currents, as a street disorder in Dublin a few weeks ago shows. But we're a nation of people who have been the source of immigration for many, many centuries. You don't get to be Irish and racist, and I'm proud of the political leadership from across the spectrum against far-right agitation in Dublin in recent weeks. I want to briefly address the applicability of this bill in Northern Ireland. Human rights exist precisely to protect people from the type of politics that are behind this bill. Human rights frameworks exist to stop politicians degrading shared values for their narrow political interest. The protection of rights for everybody in Northern Ireland from all communities under Article 2 of the Windsor Framework has been welcomed across civil society. Even the UK government have called Article 2 uncontroversial. Not for the first time, I say thank goodness for the Good Friday Agreement, which has been a lifeboat for our region and some of the damaging, terrible politics of recent years. That's a large part of why so many people, including in this chamber, have desperately tried to undermine that agreement through Brexit. But thanks to that agreement, which the international community prevented this government from trashing under their previous two Prime Ministers, but it's thanks to that agreement that we do continue to enjoy, in theory, rights and protections that this government is so determined to burn for people in England and Scotland and Wales. But the existence of those rights has enraged the far right in Northern Ireland. A few voices who angrily prowl the internet seeking to suffocate anything or positive or humanitarian that happens in our region, who seem so desperate to strip legal rights away from everybody else. They'd like to legally review themselves everything that can't run away. They are protesting that this miserable bill might not apply in Northern Ireland due to the Windsor Framework. I regret to say that in practice immigration law has already been applied in Northern Ireland without differentiation, as an upcoming challenge to the Illegal Migration Act will hear. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will oppose this bill and we will oppose other attempts to unite and balance the Conservative Party on the backs of the most vulnerable. The Illegal Migration Bill failed to do that. The Nationalities and Borders Bill failed to do that. This is just red meat for a common sense group with no common sense, a research group that does no research, and a star chamber that has no stars. This bill is for them and for no one else.
Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to join the Shadow Home Secretary in moving the reasoned amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to start by sending my condolences to the friends and family of the asylum seeker who tragically died whilst on the Bibi Stockholm this morning. I'd also like to thank all those across the House who've sent their condolences to my family and I over the past 10 days. We've been overwhelmed by the flood of tributes and messages which have made us prouder than ever of what my mum was and all that she achieved. So it would be very tempting for me to respond by taking a more conciliatory approach to this debate today. But given the state of the legislation that's before us, and given everything that my mother stood for, I think she'd be absolutely appalled that such a thought might ever cross my mind. So let's get stuck in, shall we? I'd firstly like to start by thanking the House for an excellent debate, with gratitude in particular to my honourable friends on these benches who spoke with such passion and logic and conviction throughout the course of this debate. And of course I'd like to welcome the latest Immigration Minister to his post. I note that the performance of his predecessor led the Prime Minister to conclude that the job was too big for one Conservative member alone, so they've cut the position in two. Well, the more the merrier, I say. Welcome one and all. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I began in this post 2 years ago, my first opposite number was fronting the Nationality and Borders Bill, which effectively handed each asylum seeker who crossed the Channel a badge saying, "I am inadmissible for asylum," whilst making no provision for what practically could be done with those unprocessed claimants. And so they duly ended up in taxpayer-funded emergency hotels at a cost of £8 million a day. Next up was my second opposite number, with the Illegal Migration Bill. It was rushed through Parliament, yet not a single one of its core measures on detention and removal have been enacted. The Act is on the shelf, gathering dust. And now we have my third opposite number, who's well and truly taken one for the team by agreeing to introduce this utterly absurd piece of legislation, a bill which his predecessor described as a further betrayal of Tory voters. So the deck chairs have been rearranged, but the Titanic is still steaming towards the iceberg. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Rwanda scheme is its origin story. Cast your mind back to April 2022, Madam Deputy Speaker. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, but he was in the eye of the Partygate storm. So he cooked up a cunning plan to rescue his premiership, which I believe became known as Operation Save Big Dog. And lo, the Rwanda scheme was born. Now, like every other scheme that Mr. Johnson's ever been associated with, it was extortionately expensive and doomed to fail. Yet here we are, 18 months, 2 Prime Ministers, 2 Home Secretaries and 3 Immigration Ministers later, and the benches opposite are still shackled to a policy that was only ever to be designed to be a diversion from a scandal. Now, true to form, the Rwanda scheme is still being deployed as a skin-saving operation, the only difference being that it's the current Prime Minister who is desperately trying to cling to power by burnishing his Faragist credentials to keep the circling vultures at bay. It really is déjà vu all over again. I turn now to the substance of this new Please, Please, Please Make Rwanda Safe bill, which is without doubt the most absurd piece of legislation I've ever seen, because it does nothing at all to make Rwanda safe. It just asserts that Rwanda is safe and that our courts are not allowed to say otherwise. It argues that black is white and white is black, that the grass is blue and the sky is green. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the spirit of this legislation, I'm thinking I might try to introduce a bill which deems that Wales actually won the Rugby World Cup recently. Further still, the Rwandan government is calling the shots. Having extracted 300 million, or today we think we heard 400 million, from the British government, Mr. Kagame is now instructing the Prime Minister not to do anything that might break international law. It really is quite extraordinary. How ironic that some on the benches opposite rail against our international legal obligations, and yet they seemed quite content to allow Kigali to dictate the terms of our asylum policies. So much for taking back control. And the upshot of this fiasco is that the Prime Minister has gone for a fudge. The Supreme Court judgment was his opportunity to stop flogging the dead horse that the Rwanda scheme has clearly become, but he has chosen not to take it. And he is not also prepared to go with the full-fat option that some on the benches opposite are urging him to adopt. So inevitably, his semi-skimmed formula satisfies nobody because, as everybody, from this side of the House to even the former Home Secretary have said, it is destined to fail, both legally and in operational terms. The fundamental contradictions at the heart of this bill are also quite astonishing. First, the Home Secretary told us from that dispatch box last week that the bill complies with international law. But the very first page of the bill confirms that he's actually not sure that it does. Second, the bill says that Rwanda is safe for refugees, but then also states that the government might need to offer refuge to asylum seekers from, checks notes, Rwanda. Third, it's meant to be about stopping what the government calls illegal migrants from seeking sanctuary in the UK. But if one of these asylum seekers commits a crime in Rwanda, then that person can be sent back to, checks notes again, the UK. Never mind Operation Save Big Dog, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is Operation Dog's Breakfast. But the Rwanda scheme is not only unlawful, it is also unaffordable and unworkable. Firstly, let's give credit where credit is due. The Rwandan government has played a blinder on this one, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. They really did see this Prime Minister coming. I mean, £400 million for absolutely nothing in return, no questions asked, really is a sweet deal. Although never let it be said that the party opposite has failed to get any flights off to Rwanda, because they absolutely have. They have proudly flown not one, not two, but 3 Home Secretaries to Kigali. So I guess you could say that so far it's £130 million per Home Secretary, which I'm sure the British people will see as an excellent use of their taxpayers' money. I will do.
I think the honourable member, he will know that I work for his father and my daughter worked for his mother. Does he think that this whole facade is about a form of international development? They don't like international development. This is a way of actually targeting one country and giving 200 million pounds.
Well, I thank my honourable friend and thank you for his kind words as well. He's absolutely right that the vast majority of people fleeing war and persecution end up in neighbouring countries in the region in which their plight is generated. And of course, we need to have an overseas development programme that is focused and is seeking, through enlightened self-interest, to ensure that we support those countries. Now, we're constantly told by the benches opposite that the Rwanda scheme will act as a deterrent, but that claim simply does not stand up to scrutiny, because Rwanda can take less than 1% of the asylum seekers who cross the channel in small boats. And when you're dealing with people who have already risked life and limb to get as far as northern France, it is inconceivable that they will be deterred by a 1% risk of anything. The Labour Party has therefore been steadfast in our opposition to this madness from the very outset. We on these benches are absolutely committed to stopping the Tory boat's chaos, but we will never vote for a madcap gimmick that is unaffordable, unworkable and unlawful. We have constantly said that the government needs to redirect the money that's being squandered on this nonsense into a cross-border police unit, a new returns unit and a security partnership with Europol that can stop the Tory boat's chaos at source. And we have consistently called for the government to speed up decision-making and remove the 30% of asylum seekers who fail to get leave to remain, swiftly and safely. A small upfront investment in Labour's plan would save the taxpayer an enormous £2 billion. Our reasoned amendment sets out why this bill is a sham and what the government should be doing instead, and I urge all members across all benches to get behind it. And I trust that, in his concluding remarks, the Minister will confirm whether or not the government will be accepting any significant amendments at committee stage for this bill, because the House really deserves that clarity, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Conservative Party is no longer a serious party at all. It's a rabble, an alphabet soup of factions and cabals. The former Home Secretary is constantly on manoeuvres, and the former Immigration Minister is firing broadsides on a daily basis. And we have a Prime Minister who is so desperate to save his own skin that he apparently invited an outfit called the New Conservatives to number 10 for breakfast this morning. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality is that the Prime Minister wasn't actually at the table at all. He was on the menu, consumed by the warring factions in his party, devoured by his own weakness and lack of judgment. Madam Deputy Speaker, our country simply cannot afford more of this chaos. We're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and our public services are crumbling. But we have a Conservative Party that is at war with itself and completely incapable of governing. But the good news is that the Prime Minister does have a way out of this mess, Madam Deputy Speaker. He can call a general election so that voters across this country can kick him and his shambolic administration out of office and finally give our country the leadership that it needs and deserves. Thank you.
Before I call the Minister, can I just say once again how important it is for those who have contributed to a debate to get back in good time to hear the opposition front bench as well as the Minister, and not to be late. Minister Michael Tomlins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. May I first of all join the honourable gentleman, the member for Aberavon, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and the Shadow Home Secretary, in sending my sincere condolences to the friends and families of the person who died on the Bibi Stockholm. May I also thank the honourable gentleman for his warm welcome to me. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's right to say that I have received from many colleagues on both sides of the House warm messages of congratulations on taking on this role, and I'm sure that at least some of them were genuine and that they meant it. May I also pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Newark. May I pay tribute to for his work in this role, to him personally. May I say, perhaps within the privacy of this chamber, how sorry I was to see him resign, and how I welcomed and respected the work that he has done in this role, and how I look forward to working constructively with him in the future. It is right to say, and I agree with him, that there is a disagreement between us, but it is a good faith disagreement. He was right when he said that, and I agree with him. I agree with his point about the need for legal certainty, and I commit to working with him on that very point. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, may I take the central thrust of this bill and tackle head-on the point that the Honourable Gentleman has made? Because the point of this bill is to address the concerns that the Supreme Court set out on the 15th of November of last month. It is right to say that I respect the judgment of the Supreme Court. As a former law officer, Madam Deputy Speaker, perhaps you'd expect me to say nothing less. And it is because we respect that judgment that we have looked at it so carefully, that we have responded not just with this bill, which seems to have escaped many honourable and right honourable members opposite, but with a treaty, with an internationally binding treaty that my right honourable friend secured in Kigali last week. This bill was subsequently tabled, and we are debating it here at second reading. And that built, of course, on the Memorandum of Understanding that my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, secured all those years ago. And I will, if I may, come back to her speech, and I was very grateful for her contribution. But perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can pick up some of the threads of the debate in this way. What we have heard from some of the contributions is what I would phrase as the moral case for stopping the boats, the compassionate case for stopping the boats, the reason why it is a moral imperative that we stop these modern-day slavers, that we smash these criminal gangs who are trying to push vulnerable people across the busiest shipping lane in the world, where people have lost their lives. Those of us on this side of the House are determined to take action. We are determined to smash those gangs, the modern-day slavery of our time. And some have raised the monetary cost. Some have said, well, how much is this costing us? Well, I ask, what about the human cost? What about the human misery? What about the human misery that the slavers are actually driving people to? There is nothing compassionate. There is nothing compassionate about having an open borders policy, and that is what we have heard too much of today and in the past weeks and months. Can I address the point about the strength of the bill and the concern that many on this side of the House have raised, legitimately raised, about concerns about spurious claims that may be made, that some claims may be made about... Of course I'll give way to the Honourable Lady, Honourable Gentleman, specifically on the point of spurious claims. He has an Honourable Lady behind him who may be seeking to intervene in a few moments. To the Honourable Gentleman.
Ever so much, Minister, and I'm grateful for you giving way. Can he tell the House, in his view, how many people will be deported to Rwanda next year?
It will start off in the hundreds and it will scale up to the thousands. Can I say that I enjoyed his speech? Whenever he speaks, I always think he's a smile behind the grimace and behind the stare. I always enjoy speaking, and I always hear him being heckled, enjoy hearing him being heckled from this side of the House as well. Those on this side are anxious about spurious claims being made, about people asserting that they are unwell, that they are not fit to fly, when the contrary is the case. Can we say that those who are crossing in small boats, who actually are making the crossings, not those who are unwell, but those who are fit young men. 84% of those who are making the crossings are male. 77% of those are aged between 18 and 39. So I agree with my honourable and right honourable friends when they say they want to make this work, when they say they want to make it legally tight. That is absolutely right, and I want to join them in that endeavour. How could I refuse my honourable?
So much. I'm most grateful. I wish to be a little formal about this. Will my right honourable friend seek a ruling from Mr. Speaker that the long title and the scope of the bill will or may be amended to ensure that amendments may be moved and selected, at least by the government, and even by backbenchers, as on previous occasions?
May I say directly to my honourable friend that I will continue to work with him on this. I will come back to his specific points, and I will come back and address, I hope, his very concern, perhaps specifically in response to his neighbour's points during the course of his speech as well. May I pick up my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, who actually spoke powerfully and directly about her contribution to this, as well as my honourable friend, the member for North Norfolk, my honourable friend, the member for Torbay, and others as well. Because she said rightly, she talked about the UNHCR and the EU. Let's debate this. Let's have this point. Because the very day after the UNHCR were advocating in the Supreme Court that Rwanda was not safe, how galling was it to see that the UNHCR itself sent 168 refugees to Rwanda, 168, the very next day, as a part of hundreds of thousands, a scheme that is already up and running, and supported and backed by the EU to the tune of millions of euros.
Exactly.
And we need to hear more of that, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Let me come to contributions in the short time that I've got left from honourable and right honourable members. The honourable member for Strangford and the right honourable member for East Antrim raised a specific point that I want to address head on. This bill will apply in full in Northern Ireland in the same way that it does in the rest of the United Kingdom. It is explicit, it is on the face of the bill, and will always be the case, reflecting that immigration policy is a UK-wide matter. I want to be particularly clear that nothing in the Windsor Framework or the TCA agreement affects that. Where people have raised concern is around the rights chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In addition, I want to be clear that the rights chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement does not affect any clause within this bill in any way. I think I have time to address the specific concern that the honourable member for Strangford raised earlier on in the debate. It is important to be clear the 2005 Procedures Directive is not within the annexes of the Windsor Framework. Yes, of course I give it.
Very Robinson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Minister for addressing those points as clearly as he did. He will acknowledge that while he has addressed them in his closing remarks this evening, the Home Office published legal advice yesterday that didn't touch on any of these points. Could I ask the Minister to take steps in the days that come to go further and update that legal guidance, that legal advice, in a way that encompasses the points that he's just raised to assuage the concerns of the House this evening?
Minister.
May I give the honourable gentleman this commitment, that I will continue to work with him on the points that he has raised. And I need to be careful about legal advice as a former law officer. What has been published is a government legal position statement. That is different from legal advice, and he will understand the differences in relation to that position. But he has heard what I said, and I was grateful to him for welcoming the points that I made in response to the specific concerns that were raised. May I come back to my honourable friend, the member for Stone, because he mentioned the House of Lords Select Committee, the Constitution Committee. Madam Deputy Speaker, that gave me flashbacks to my grilling by that illustrious committee when I was sitting alongside my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, in my formal role as Solicitor General. And we followed that very report that my honourable friend, the member for Stone, mentioned. May I turn to the Chair of the Select Committee, the honourable member for Kingston upon Hull North, the Chair of the Select Committee for the Public Accounts Committee, the honourable member for Hackney South and Shoreditch. And the simple point I would say to her is I can't address each and every one of her points here, but I know that she's looking forward to asking me some specific questions tomorrow afternoon when I attend her committee with my honourable friend, the member for Corby. We then had, Madam Deputy Speaker, what I'm going to describe as a former law officer fest. We had the pleasure of hearing from my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Torwich and West Devon. We had the pleasure of listening to my honourable and learned friend, the chairman of the Select Committee. We had the pleasure of listening and hearing from my predecessor, my illustrious predecessor, my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Swindon South. And I'm pleased to say that I am now a former law officer as well. And we therefore have a joint endeavour and a joint interest in making sure that this legislation works. I've mentioned my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, and I've mentioned her important point about Rwanda and the rather patronising tone that is sometimes raised by members opposite when it comes to our international partners who have signed up to an internationally binding legal treaty with this country. Oh, of course I'll give way.
welcome the Immigration Minister to his post. Is he aware that while he's been speaking, the New Conservatives, the European Research Group, the Northern Research Group, the Conservative Growth Group and the Common Sense Group have all said that they cannot support the bill and are going to abstain tonight? Does he accept that this looks like the Prime Minister's breakfast meeting was a total failure? And does he accept this is just complete civil war in the Conservative Party?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the answer is no, no and no. I am here. I have been in the chamber. May I turn to my right honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Bournemouth West, and may I thank my constituency neighbour for his delivery, for a powerful and compassionate speech, as he always gives. May I turn to my right honourable friend, the member for Clwyd West. He asked me to work with him, he asked me to be open-minded, he asked me to look at ways to make the bill more effective. In contrast to the previous intervention, my answer is yes, yes and yes. He and I have worked together before, and I commit to continuing to work again with him in the rest of the court passage of the course of this bill. In the time that I've got, forgive me, I won't. In the time that I've got left, I'm going to refer to my honourable friend, the member for Devizes. I hope he will continue to work with me on this bill. I listened very carefully to what he had to say. I listened with great interest to my honourable friend, the member for Barrow and Furness, who is a member of the Select Committee and spoke with great authority. My honourable friend, the member for Dover, who spoke very clearly about her position and how the impact on her constituency, the direct impact on her constituency, and the imperative of making sure that we stop the boats. My honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough, the speech in my notes, it's described as that he was on fire. That's what my notes say. He was on fire. And those who missed his speech should go and watch it again on playback. My honourable friend was on fire, and I was grateful for his contribution. My honourable friend, the member for Runnymede and Weybridge, who made a powerful, measured and careful speech. And I was grateful for his earlier intervention during the course of the debates as well. My honourable friend, the member for Ruislip, Norwood and Pinner, I thank him for his contribution. I thank him in particular and sincerely for mentioning our late colleague James Brokenshire and for mentioning the work that he did so ably in this area. My honourable friend, the member for Boston and Skegness. Common sense from Boston is what my notes say here, and I thank him for his contribution. My honourable friend from Don Valley, there were attempts to shout him down whilst he was speaking. He stood up, as he often does, and he stood up in this chamber in the face of that barrage. He talks openly about his faith, and I respect him sincerely for the way that he does that and for the way that he conducts his business in this chamber. My honourable friend, the member for Bury North, who has the distinction of serving on not one but two select committees. Not only does he do that, Madam Deputy Speaker, but he does it with distinction and with diligence. And I always like listening to his speeches. He had the temerity to suggest that lawyers may from time to time disagree with each other. What an outrageous suggestion he made. I'm only sorry that there weren't more lawyers in the chamber to hear that particular point. My honourable friend, the member for Broughton, made an outstanding speech. The inescapable, the inestimable, the irresistible logic of my honourable friend's speech. More people should have been here to hear what he said. It was absolutely logical, it was compelling. My honourable friend, the member for Torbay, I have turned to him before and I thank him as well for being, as one of my predecessors, for his work in this area, for pointing out what has already happened since the Supreme Court, namely the treaty. My honourable friend, the member for North Norfolk, gave us actual numbers, not just a percentage, but actually turning it into numbers. And my honourable friend, the member for Gloucester, took us on a tour du monde. It is not just our country that is facing these challenges. This is a challenge of our time. This is a global challenge. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me end with this. I have sat through this debate. Out of the 6.5-hour debate, I have sat here for more than 6 hours of it. I have heard every single speech from this side of the House and most speeches from the other side. I have heard every single front bench speech from the Labour Party, and what was missing was a plan. Labour have no plan. Intervention after intervention. Where is the plan? There was chuntering from the Home Secretary from a sedentary position, Madam Deputy Speaker. Where is the plan? Answer came there none. There was a verbal vacuum. There wasn't even a cut and paste solution. There was no plan whatsoever. Contrast that with the clear determination of all of those on this side of the chamber to stop the boats. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Order. The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed, as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby. Order. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. Tell us for the ayes, Jeff Smith and Colleen Fletcher. Tell us for the noes, Mark Fletcher and Amanda Soloway.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 269. The noes to the left, 337.
The ayes to the right, 269. The noes to the left, 337. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! The contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby.
Days, but it does feel like a bit of a throwback. The difference here, of course, is that this is a policy which most Conservative MPs, in broad principle, do agree on, and yet they've ended up in a situation, the healthy majority, where there was speculation that the government might not be able to get it through, which would have been the first time since 1986. Because just to explain how it works, the second reading of a bill is just a broad discussion of the principles. So normally they go through with no problem at all. 1986 under Margaret Thatcher was the last time there was a beat at that stage. And what happens after that is then they go through the detail, they go into what's called committee stage, and then it might or might not get changed. Then it goes to third reading. And then
The bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Mark Fletcher and Amanda Soloway. Tellers for the noes, Colleen Fletcher and Jeff Swift.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 313. The noes to the left, 269.
They're cheering a majority of 80.
Order. The ayes to the right, 313. The noes to the left, 269. So the ayes have it, unlocked. We now come to the programme motion to be moved formally. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of us are of that opinion, say aye. The contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby.
Yes, excuse me. Bakunzi ba East Africa Daily, turi buze gusubira nimugoroba ariko reka ku bantu bamwe bakurikiye iyi deba y'iki tora birangiye iri tegeko, iyi bill ni nk'itegeko ariko ntabwo birarangira mu by'ukuri. Guverinoma ya Sunak igize amahirwe yo kugira ngo ikomeze ijye imbere, so igiye kuva ahangaha babonye amajwi 313, abandi babyamaganye ni Impaka.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Mark Fletcher and Amanda Soloway. Tellers for the noes, Gavin Newlands and Peter Grant.